Somewhere on the steppe north of the Gobi Desert, in the year 1206, Temujin sat at the Kurultai, the great assembly of the Mongol clans, and received a name. From that moment he was called Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The assembled shamans burned fires. White horses were sacrificed. Fermented milk was distributed from vessels that had not been empty in 3 days of ceremony. What the European sources would eventually call the Mongol miracle, the conquest of roughly 40 million square kilometers, an area larger than the combined landmass of every empire that had ever preceded it, was explained for centuries by two things: the speed of the cavalry and the savagery of the men. A primitive people who got lucky, nomads with nothing to lose and nowhere to be, who overwhelmed civilization through sheer relentless motion. Then the ancient DNA arrived. In 2020, the largest study of ancient genomic data from the Eurasian steppe published its findings in Nature. The steppe had been producing armies for 3,000 years before Genghis Khan was born. The Scythians had ridden it. The Huns had emerged from it. The Turks had crossed it. Every one of those peoples had left a genetic signature the study could now read. What the Mongol expansion left behind in the genome was unlike anything that had come before. The textbooks will tell you the Mongol army was superior because it was mobile, that the horses were the technology, that the composite bow was the weapon no European armor could stop, that the strategy, the feigned retreat, the double envelopment, the coordination across distances Roman generals never attempted, was the genius of Genghis Khan. And all of that is partly right and entirely incomplete. Because what the textbooks leave out is the body of the man who rode the horse and drew the bow, not what he wore, not what he carried, what was running through his blood when he rode 100 miles without stopping. The Mongol warrior was not a lucky savage. He was the end product of a pharmacological tradition older than the empire, refined by specialists whose institutional role was older than the dynasty, and whose preparations produced a physical state that the armies they destroyed had no equivalent for and no framework to explain. To understand what that tradition produced, you have to first understand what a Mongol body was actually doing during a campaign. The Mongol army moved at speeds the military literature of every culture it encountered called impossible. The 1,241 invasion of Europe, Hungary and Poland simultaneously, armies operating on separate lines of advance hundreds of miles apart, required coordination across distances that had no equivalent in the European military tradition. The Mongol columns covered ground that European knights on fresh horses could not have matched across the same period. This was not horse technology. European horses were in many contexts larger and faster. It was body technology. The Mongol way of war required a body that could endure conditions that broke the soldiers of every settled civilization it encountered. Weeks without fixed camps, sleeping in the saddle, eating on the move, maintaining complex tactical coordination through cold and heat and wind across terrain with no roads, no supply depots, no reinforcement coming from behind. The institution that produced the Mongol warrior for this was not a military academy. It was a way of life. And it was reinforced and sharpened at its most critical edges by the specialists whose function was the most misunderstood in the entire structure of the Mongol world. The specialists were the shamans. The Bo, as the Mongol shaman was known in the tradition that predated the empire and outlasted it, was not a priest in any sense the word implies in a settled religious framework. He was a pharmacologist, a physician, and a combat preparation specialist who operated inside the military command structure with a status the chronicles describe as second only to the Khan himself in certain operational decisions. The shaman read the conditions before a campaign began. The shaman prepared the warriors before they rode. What the shaman prepared was not a prayer, it was a compound. And the botanical tradition he was working from had been accumulating across the Central Asian steppe for generations. The first substance is kumiss, fermented mare's milk. Every source that touched the Mongol world described it. Carpini, who traveled to the Mongol court in 1245, Rubruk, who reached it in 1253, Marco Polo, whose account arrived a generation later. The preparation is specific. Mare's milk collected while the mare is nursing, placed in a leather vessel, agitated repeatedly over hours until the fermentation process produces a liquid the color of thin whey with a sharp, sour taste and a smell that no European traveler described neutrally. The active compounds in kumiss are more complex than a simple alcohol preparation. Fermented mare's milk contains ethanol at concentrations between 2 and 4%, but that is only the beginning of what it delivers. The fermentation produces lactic acid bacteria at concentrations that act as natural antimicrobials. It delivers bioavailable protein, fat, and essential vitamins including B12 and vitamin C, the vitamin that the winter steppe otherwise provided in no form at all. Mare's milk has a fat composition closer to human milk than cow's milk, making it more rapidly digestible than any other available nutrition source on the steppe. The ethanol, at the concentrations present in kumiss, produces the anxiolytic effect that has made fermented drink a feature of warrior preparation across virtually every culture in recorded history. But in the Mongol preparation, the ethanol was also the delivery vehicle, because the leather vessels the kumiss was prepared in did not contain only the starter culture of lactic acid bacteria. They contained what the tradition had put in them. The second substance is ephedra, in the Chinese pharmaceutical tradition that the Mongols drew on as their empire expanded into China. It appears as mahuang. On the steppe, it was prepared as a tea, a decoction, a dried addition to fermented milk. Ephedra sinica and its related species grow across the entire Central Asian steppe, from the Gobi to the Hungarian plain. The plant is unremarkable in appearance, a jointed green shrub growing in dry rocky ground, and its pharmacological properties are documented with a precision that has made its active compounds the basis of modern clinical pharmacology. The active compounds are ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. Both are alkaloids acting on the sympathetic nervous system, stimulating the release of norepinephrine and producing effects that 2 centuries of clinical literature have documented in detail. Ephedrine dramatically increases heart rate and cardiac output. It increases blood pressure and dilates the bronchial passages, improving oxygen delivery to working muscle. It dramatically suppresses fatigue. It extends the period of sustained physical performance before exhaustion forces the body to stop. It elevates core body temperature, providing a buffer against cold exposure that an unmedicated body cannot maintain at the same level. And at the doses produced by the steppe preparation, it produces a sustained heightening of alertness and physical capacity that extends for hours without the collapse that follows alcohol or the sedation that follows opium. The Mongol horseman riding 100 miles in winter was not overcoming exhaustion through willpower or character. His sympathetic nervous system was running on a stimulant whose refined modern descendants are now regulated as controlled substances. Ephedrine was doing what ephedrine does. It was extending the operational window of the body beyond what any unmedicated body could sustain. The third component is blood, not a symbolic or ritual consumption. The documented practice described by multiple medieval sources, including Carpini, was precise and clinical. A Mongol rider on an extended operation without access to other food would make a small incision in the jugular vein of his horse, drink a controlled quantity of blood, and seal the wound. The horse survived. The rider continued. Fresh horse blood delivers iron, protein, water, and electrolytes at concentrations that act as emergency rations with immediate bioavailability. The practice was not a cultural curiosity. It was a survival technology that eliminated one of the fundamental constraints on extended cavalry operations. The Mongol army did not need a supply train because the horses that carried the army were also, when necessary, the supply train. Layer ephedrine-mediated sympathetic stimulation on top of a nutritional base sustained by kumiss and emergency blood rations on top of a body shaped since childhood by a nomadic life that European cavalry training had no equivalent for, and you do not have a savage on a fast horse. You have applied physiology layered on applied pharmacology, producing a soldier whose operational parameters were categorically different from anything the settled civilizations in his path had encountered. European chroniclers tried to describe what they were looking at and reached for the language of the supernatural. The Mongols were called demons, servants of the devil, men who did not sleep and could not be stopped. Matthew Paris, the English chronicler writing from a distance that spared him direct experience, called them a monstrous and inhuman race. What he was describing was a pharmacological and physiological profile that had no precedent in the military literature available to him. The settled world had no category for a soldier who did not need the things soldiers needed to function: fixed camps, supply lines, rest, meals at predictable intervals, because the chemistry had already addressed those requirements before the campaign began. At the Battle of Legnica in April 1241, a combined force of Polish knights, German knights from the Teutonic Order, and Silesian infantry, a formation that would have been competitive against any contemporary European army, was destroyed in a single engagement. The Mongol general Baidur did not outnumber them significantly. He outpaced them, outlasted them, and operated at a tempo the European force could not match. At Mohi the same month, Batu Khan destroyed the Hungarian royal army. The pursuit that followed continued for days, the Mongol cavalry running down refugees across terrain and at speeds that Hungarian riders on fresh horses could not escape. The men conducting that pursuit had been in continuous campaign for months. They were not fresh. They were not sleeping in beds or eating prepared meals. They were running on kumiss and ephedra and the physiology the steppe had spent centuries producing. The unmedicated European knight, trained for shock combat over short distances, had no framework for what he was encountering. He was not losing to a better weapon. He was losing to a better body operating on a pharmacological system that had been refined over centuries before the first Mongol standard was raised at the Kurultai. The institution that maintained this tradition was the shaman's role within the Ordu, the military administrative structure of the Mongol world. The Mongol Tumen, the 10,000-man unit that formed the basic operational formation of the army, was not simply a military division. It carried within its structure the full apparatus of the nomadic world: the herds, the families, the specialists, and the shamans whose pharmacological function was as integral to the operational capacity of the unit as the horses themselves. The Bu traveled with the army. He prepared the preparations. He managed the dose. When the Mongol world fragmented after the death of the great Khan's successors, the coherent institutional structure dispersed with it. The four khanates maintained different fragments of the practice in increasingly diluted forms. The shaman's institutional role was gradually dismantled. The men themselves did not disperse. This is where the ancient DNA changes the story. A 2003 paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics, authored by a team led by Tyler Smith and Wells, documented a specific Y chromosome lineage, haplogroup C2*-ST, present at unusually high frequencies across a vast geographic swath of Eurasia. The lineage was concentrated in a region centered on Mongolia and declined in frequency with distance from it in every direction: east into Korea and Manchuria, west across Central Asia and into Russia, south into Iran and Afghanistan. The statistical signature was not subtle. The researchers estimated that approximately 8% of all men within the former territory of the Mongol Empire carried this lineage, a figure translating to roughly 16 million living men at the time of the study, representing approximately 1 in 200 of all men alive on Earth. The cause of the expansion was identified with a precision rare in genetic inference. A single founding individual living in the region of Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago, whose descendants had reproduced at dramatically elevated rates compared to the surrounding population, across a geographic range that matched the Mongol Empire almost exactly. A 2020 study published in Nature, drawing on the largest ancient DNA dataset ever assembled from the Eurasian steppe, spanning 4,000 years and dozens of archaeological cultures, confirmed and expanded the picture. The Mongol genetic expansion was documented as one of the most dramatic events in the human demographic record. Not as history, as biology. The Y chromosome does not lie about this kind of event. Population replacement at this scale leaves a signature that does not fade across 1,000 years of subsequent demographic change. The lines of male descent running through the modern populations of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Russia, and a dozen other countries carry in their genome the record of what happened on the steppe between 1206 and 1294. The genetic signature of the Mongol expansion is still present in the living bodies of people across Eurasia, still traceable across 30 generations of subsequent admixture, still readable by the same modern chemistry that can extract and sequence ancient DNA from bone fragments in a burial mound on the Mongolian steppe. The Bö did not survive the Christianization and Islamization of the steppe peoples who inherited the territory after the empire fragmented. His role had no place in the religious orders that replaced the shamanic tradition across Central Asia over the following centuries. The Ordu did not survive the fragmentation of the Khanates. The shaman's institutional role was dismantled by the same forces that dismantled every other institution in this series of stories. The ephedra plant was not dismantled. It is still in the ground. The same steppe, the same species, the same molecule that ran through the bloodstream of the rider who destroyed the Hungarian royal army at Mohi in April 1241 and did not stop riding for 3 more days. The empire is 40 million square kilometers of historical record. The chemistry is still growing in the same soil. The institution ended. The molecule did not. The molecule is older than the empire. The empire is older than its collapse. The collapse ended the production line. The steppe is unchanged. The plant is unchanged. And the descendants of the men who drank what the Bö prepared before the riders left for Hungary and Poland and China and Persia are still walking the same grasslands. Their genetic signature is in the soil of every country the empire crossed. The chemistry that put it there is still in the ground beneath their feet. If you want more stories where the chemistry outlives the kingdom, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.